executive function is a process in our brain, primarily a process in the very front of our brain, the what we call the prefrontal cortex in the left and the right hemispheres. And these and a couple of other brain networks, brain processes are absolutely critical in allowing us to think and problem solve and to be aware and to pay attention and to be resilient and curious in our thinking, to have some self-control. It's also related to processes like working memory and, as I said, flexible thinking, critical thinking, all of those aspects of thought that are so essential in our learning, but are so essential in day-to-day life. I love, Sheldon, what you said, kids aren't necessarily testing us. I think sometimes, as we talked about before we started recording, in part, there's some children at certain developmental stages that it's perfectly normal for them to test us. And though I've always said to my staff and even the parents with whom I support, if they would, they could. In other words, so rarely are children or our students intentionally not engaging with learning, are intentionally not wanting to pay attention, are intentionally switching off their executive function capacities. It's just not the case. It may be more difficult for them. So, like all learning, these processes in our brain, these executive function processes in our brain, we have a capacity, some degree of capacity. Each of us have a strength in our executive functioning thinking. So think about those students really that we rely on, those students that we know will keep track of their assignments, even other kids' assignments. They'll manage their own projects. They'll manage their own home life, part-time job. They seem to really have it together. Even those younger kids that seem to develop independence really quickly, maturity, we tend, as I said, to rely on them. They're the responsible ones, the ones we don't need to worry about. Well, the reality is they're not just raised well or, came out of the womb that way. They happen to have strong executive function. So then think about the other side of that spectrum. And these are children or adults. We all have them in their lives. Hopefully we are the ones that are helping people with their own problems or maintaining our own independence. But we know those children and those, as I said, these adults in our lives who rely on others to do the problem solving and to do the organization and to help them attend to their tasks or to redirect them to their tasks. And there are some students who really seem incapacitated in those processes, in those executive functioning processes to sustain and keep attention, to make good and quick decisions, to delay gratification, the famous marshmallow test. That's part of this executive function world. So it doesn't mean that students are willfully disregarding, the norms, the academic norms, the social norms. It's because the processes, the parts of their brain that are responsible for executive functioning in general is weak. And then, of course, we have, all of those students in between. We have students who can reasonably manage with independent tasks as long as they have a little bit of help, as long as they have a little bit of nudge. So they're somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. So really executive function, a series of critical brain functions, essential in school, essential throughout life. And all of us have a certain degree of capacity, either strong or weak or somewhere in between.
Okay, thank you for setting the tone here. And I want to make sure I heard something right. Maybe I misheard it. So I want to ask a question because it sounded like you said having high executive functioning skills. Does that necessarily relate to you came from a certain type of home life? Is that what I heard as far as like, it doesn't necessarily mean you came from, I just want you to clarify that because I think that's what I heard.
Let me make sure I'm clear. I think in general, it's a really, whether we're talking about key critical topic in learning, in education in general, I think what's really, really important is we are born with a brain of a certain capacity, and that capacity is not fixed. That is not the brain that we will live with or endure for the rest of our lives. It is constantly adapting. It is constantly growing and changing. And frankly, hopefully for the better. In other words, there are opportunities for positive brain growth, positive brain change, positive brain development. And of course, there is negative brain change. So in our first conversation, Sheldon, we talked about neuroplasticity, this capacity of our brains to change and grow. Well, equally, there's a capacity of our brains to be injured, to be damaged, or to be negatively rewired, not positively rewired, not made stronger, but certain connections made stronger in our brains that are actually leading to more damaging issues. For example, addiction is likely our brains being wired to repeat negative experiences until our brains, literally, that is our natural flow of activity. So, in learning and executive function, I do really want to reinforce that it's not a set of skills that can be taught from an early age, at an early age, or at least not necessarily. It's a part of our brain. They're not skills that can be taught, they're parts of our brains. And they're parts of our brains that may be strong from birth, they may be weak from birth, and they can be improved through positive or even specific exercise.
Okay, so I want to understand as far as where organization, like being organized, because you mentioned early in our conversation how there's certain students that we know they're going to have their homework on time. They're going to do this. They're very organized. The locker looks good, looks clean. It's not, their papers aren't falling out, all that kind of stuff. Where does organization fit within the executive functioning skills?
So it's a key part of it. The part of the brain, and again, it's likely the two areas here and here, although there are some other brain processes responsible for it. But these are the parts of our brain that direct behavior, and they're particularly driven to accomplish goals.
Mm-hmm.
So the goal is a clean locker, or maybe the goal realistically is I want to be able to go to my locker and know exactly, where my history book is.
Yeah.
So that those brain processes develop a plan. They develop a plan and they put that plan in place. They execute that plan. And when something interferes or interrupts that plan, those brain processes actually come up with a plan B. So, for example, if they only have 30 seconds to get to their locker, they know they're not going to have time to get their history book. Maybe
Right.
in the period before, they grabbed their history book for first period, so they don't need to go back to their locker. So the parts of our brain that are constantly thinking, they're alert. These parts of the brain are active all the time. And when they're strong, they're really good at coming up with plans and coming up, as I said, with plan Bs and sometimes up to plan Zs, given the complexities of the world. So when someone has even a mild weakness in those brain processes, organization can be tough. Now, it's
Mhm.
not impossible, but it's tougher. It's not impossible to acquire some organizational skills, but it's either more difficult, takes more time, more mistakes happen, other people need to be involved, or some strategies. And that's a really common recommendation, not just for children with learning difficulties, but all of us rely on strategies. All of us rely on external methods of organization.
I know people will make excuses and say stuff like, "Oh, I didn't do it because I have ADHD and my executive functioning was kicking in." Folks will
Uh-huh.
say stuff like that. I'm wondering if you could take some time to talk about what executive function is not. Like, what are some of the myths that are out there?
Yeah, I have found it really interesting to observe that this new trend or activity. And in some respects, I wouldn't say it's positive. I think it's sort of neutral. I think
Okay.
in some respects it's understandable. It's, as you say, kind of trendy. And maybe there are positive qualities about it in terms of normalizing struggle. And I think that's part of a movement, a bit of a movement in not in learning, I would say, but in self awareness, in self care, in health and wellness. I think actually, our response to COVID had a lot to do with this idea that let's be okay with not being okay
Hmm.
sometimes. And
Yeah.
let's share that vulnerability. So I think in part, it's been part of a much bigger, kind of movement in identifying vulnerability and identifying weakness, and that's okay. And in that respect, I'm here for it. I think it makes a lot of sense for all of us to be more comfortable and more insightful with our weaknesses as well as our strengths. But I think there's a risk here. First of all, I'm not sure for those who struggle with significant diagnosed ADHD or ADD, as it was previously called, or diagnosed and significant learning disabilities. I'm not sure how comfortable it feels for them to be a trend, to
Mm.
be a TikTok meme. I think, and I'm so sorry if I've mixed together. I don't know if TikTok is a
TikTok
meme.
meme. We'll go with it. Real, I think, is what they go with, but
Okay, I'm
yeah.
sorry. Just revealed my age. So I think there's a risk there that actually minimizing the very real struggle of having diagnosed and sometimes really debilitating experience for
Mm,
individuals and for their families. And I would argue it's not fun to be an individual who struggles every day with sometimes basic navigation of their world, whether they're in school or a work setting. Sometimes they can't maintain a professional setting because of their struggles. So I'm talking now about struggles in general, and executive function definitely is. It's not a formal diagnosis, although I certainly have read, and I'm sure you have too, lots of psych ed reports that refer to executive function as an area of difficulty or something that needs to be developed for an individual. But I think that the reality for someone experiencing those things and their families, for sure, for parents, for teachers,
mhm.
there's nothing trendy about it, and it can be very painful, and there's real suffering there. So to that end, I think that there's a risk in being somewhat flippant about forgetting something and just you know saying, "Oh, it's my ADHD."
Right,
So, and so to your question, what isn't it?
right.
I don't have a medical degree, so I can't diagnose anyone's ADHD or not ADHD, although there is a process for diagnosing such learning disabilities. But I think that what it isn't is maybe other qualities, and it may be other weaknesses. It may be other parts of their brain, or it may be the parts of their brain that are mildly underfunctioning. So to that degree, it perfectly makes sense for someone to self-identify saying, "Oh, I have this brain weakness and this causes me to do X, Y, and Z. I can never figure out how to divide up the check at the end of a nice meal with friends because I can't divide, by five and then add on the tax and the tip. And they had an extra drink and she didn't. And that's a mental load for me. And I can't figure that makes perfect sense. And that's not necessarily a learning disability. And it doesn't necessarily require medication, frankly, but it's a form of a learning difficulty. And to that extent, I think we should be perfectly comfortable recognizing tasks that are difficult for us and then exploring why might those tasks be difficult. So, in the spirit of promoting your podcast and our series together, we have talked about being curious about the
Mhm.
why. Why is it that we or others behave in certain ways, learn in certain ways, or struggle to learn or struggle to behave in certain ways? And it's very reasonable to actually map back those processes or those tendencies to parts of our brain. It's more than reasonable